Thanks everybody for coming out. I'm Dan Slater. I'm director of the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies, WCED, and just want to make a few comments to introduce the session because this event sort of lies at the intersection of two contexts that I want to put everybody in mind of. So the first context is that WCED will henceforth be editing the newsletter, the Absent newsletter, Democracy and Autocracy, formerly known as, thank you. I'm sure that will be the lightest applause of the evening, and deservedly so. I hope our contributors will get much better than that, but thank you so much. So this was formerly the Journal of Comparative Democratization, Annals of Comparative Democratization, which was run by VDEM, and Michigan has now taken it over, if you will. And so we will be doing this newsletter regularly. And the goal that we're going to have is that each issue that we do, we're going to try to pair up with some kind of roundtable. So bring people together on some kind of timely theme, and then have the joint product of both the public roundtable as well as the newsletter to be coming together in that format. So we are doing that here today, and that gets me to the second context, which is that some of you might be aware that the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, had a big 5-year project they funded called the Theories of Democratic Change Research Initiative. And the product of that project was 3 reports, 3 really quite major reports on 3 themes related to democratic change. The first report is on democratic backsliding. The second is on pathways from authoritarianism, and the third is on transitions from conflict. And all 3 of these reports involved a massive amount of intellectual labor, and they amassed an enormous amount of knowledge as well in the process. And so, like many reports, they go to government bureaucracy and might not be used to their fullest effect. So that's why today we're gathering authors from all 3 of these reports and to try to put them into conversation, both with each other and with us. And we're sort of asking the question, well, at one level, is democracy promotion dead? Or to put it in less clickbaity fashion, perhaps, what do our best theories of democratic change imply for our best practices of democracy promotion? Since we clearly live in a moment when democracy promotion's future seems fragile at best, futile at worst. Seems like a good moment to think about what democracy promotion means, whether it still has relevance, whether there still is value to it. And as you'll soon see from the presentations, the answers provided by these authors and their reports are very nuanced, they're responsible, and they're grounded in the very best academic research. So the question, is democracy promotion dead, might seem a little bit flip, but the answers you'll see are anything but. So let me just briefly introduce the 5 presenters who we have here today, who were lucky enough to get here today, before I turn over the podium to them. First, we have David Waldner, who's the co-author with Ellen Lust of Gothenburg University on the first report on democratic backsliding. David is associate professor in the Woodrow Wilson Department of Politics at the University of Virginia. Next up, we'll have Jeff Conroy-Krutz and Erica Frantz, who are co-authors of the report on pathways from authoritarianism, the second report. Jeff is associate professor. Erica is assistant professor of political science at Michigan State University. And finally, from the third report, we'll have Jennifer Dresden and Thomas Flores, who are co-authors of the report on transitions from conflict, along with Irfan Nuruddin from Georgetown University. Jennifer is the associate director of the Democracy and Governance Project at Georgetown University, and Thomas is the associate professor at the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University. So it's a real honor and a privilege to have you all assembled here. After all the work you put into this, it's great to have it kind of come to fruition here, and I really look forward to your remarks and to our discussion to follow. So thanks for being here.
Excellent. Oh, good afternoon. I'm David Waldner, as Dan just told you, and I want to thank Dan for the intellectual brain power of putting this panel together, and I want to thank Derek for doing all the great logistical work so smoothly, and we should also mention Matthew Siebel, who's doing he'll be the guest editor of the next newsletter, and he gave great feedback to all of us on our papers. Okay. So Ellen sends her regrets. She's on one of the continents, as far as I know. She's constantly moving. And to advance I advanced a lot. So Elle and I wrote the first of the three white papers for USAID on, as you can see, on democratic backsliding. And I have to say that when we started the project, we hadn't thought a lot about democratic backsliding. Ellen and I are both specialists in Middle East politics. That probably matters a little bit for the way you interpret what we have to say to you, because we spend a lot of time thinking about authoritarian politics. And when we started working on this, we were just in the throes of starting to think about some democracies in the Middle East, and we could finally join all the fun groups at APSA who talk about parties and electors and things like that. And then before you knew it, Egypt had its episode of backsliding, or further, a reversion all the way to authoritarianism. So we took this opportunity to think about a phenomenon that we didn't think was recognized, democratic backsliding, as being something distinct from the democratic breakdowns, exemplified by, of course, things like the fall of the Weimar Republic that all of us had been studying for so long. So there was a descriptive literature about cases of democratic backsliding, but not a lot of specific theorizing about backsliding itself. So our goal was to look at everything we thought we knew at the theoretical level about anything about democracy and democratic transitions in any direction, and see what we could extract from it to think about democratic backsliding itself. I should also say we didn't think explicitly about democracy promotion. We were just trying to draw some theoretical lessons. So I really welcome the opportunity to think about promotion, for democracy promotion, for this workshop in this panel. I want to say, again, the fact that I study the Middle East means that I tend to have a particular cognitive image when I hear the term democracy promotion that is not shared by everyone here. And that matters, because if I have a partial image in my brain of what I mean when I utter the phrase democracy promotion, then I'm going to give you a partial reading of the literature. And I really enjoyed reading the paper by Jen, Tom, and Irfan, which helped me realize the limits of what I had embraced when I thought about democracy promotion. They're speaking about a whole new set of democracy promoting activities, a whole new set of literatures that I'm familiar with, but as I categorize this, I wasn't thinking about field experiments in post-conflict settings about various very important behavior in which we could identify the effects. I was thinking about things like this. This is what was in the news when I was writing this paper. The big story in the Washington Post, I should say big story. I would have liked it to have been a big story. It was a blip. It was not a big story, about how American policymakers had been lying about the amount of progress we'd made in Afghanistan since 2001. And then, of course, the deepening political crisis in Iraq, as protesters came out in the streets protesting the corruption of Iraq, the inequity of the political system, the oligarchy that had taken control of the political system and actually forced a prime minister to resign. So I really approach democracy promotion primarily from thinking about state-sponsored activities, usually at a very large scale, trying to make macro-level changes in the most basic institutions of, we'll call them the host society. I was thinking first and foremost perhaps about nation building, and then a sort of a second order, the literature that I was thinking about was the literature on constitutional engineering. As countries make a transition on their own, perhaps towards democracy, what could we tell them about the best way to set up democratic institutions at the constitutional level? So that's the literature that I was addressing here. And that matters because I was thinking primarily about failures, right? There's an internal selection on the dependent variable perhaps going on in my head that is unfair, and we all make these sorts of cognitive errors, and I'm not ashamed to admit perhaps I made one of my own, and so we make some progress by correcting them. So I started thinking about I can't actually get it up here, can I? Thinking hard about the causes of failed interventions, and that's. In part some work that I'm doing now with Rob Mickey here. Second, thinking about the short-term consequences of failed interventions. We know, for example, there's some arguments we made that interventions of the sort that we made in Iraq and Afghanistan could weaken the state to such a degree that it can actually unleash civil wars, for example, new forms of violence. I don't know if any of you would be aware that in 2005 there was an effort to do a survey in Iraq of increased mortality since the American intervention of 2003. And for obvious reasons, they had to do cluster sampling of households after, and so on. And so the confidence intervals were quite large, and they came up with a point estimate of like 150,000 increased deaths in just a few years. And it was, this is what shapes my thinking about this. But also, finally, if you study the Middle East and you're looking at contemporary interventions, you know these are just the tip of the spear. Go back in history and you can find earlier interventions, et cetera. So I try to think about how failed interventions at time T0 might make, either for different circumstances or worse circumstances at time T+1. So I approached all of this very skeptically. As I say to my undergraduates, at the moral level, I'm an interventionist. Like, give me a chance to go out and make people's lives better. Oh, well, hell yeah, why not? But then I say to them, imagine you're a parent and you have a sick child, and you take your sick child to the doctor, and the doctor says, here's what we're going to do for your sick child. And you say to the doctor, and this therapy, it's been tested? And the doctor says, well, no. We have some observational data, but we're not really sure if we've identified a treatment effect. You know, would you let your child take this medicine? But we do this all the time. So I wanted to try to raise the bar a little bit. I did it in two ways, or we did it in two ways. I'm sorry. I'll try to remember to use to include Ellen in the pronouns here. First, more or less what we did in the white paper was what I'm calling here the literature on mirrors for princes and princesses, which was this sort of early modern Renaissance literature where great thinkers like Machiavelli tried to tell princes what they should do in the world. And I was thinking, well, could we political scientists do this? What do we have to tell anybody about democracy promotion? The second part of the paper sort of takes a different perspective, what we might call the clinical case study, looking retrospectively at what people have actually done, different therapies, so to speak, and whether we could make any claims about whether these have contributed to democracy promotion. In terms of being able to offer lessons, I thought it would be useful to think about what the criteria we would have to use to figure out whether we had something valuable to give to policymakers and practitioners. So I came up with this sort of list. The first idea was just the pure existence. Do we have theoretical knowledge that we think passes the basic tests that we call it internal validity to make it a little simpler here, and that we think has some external validity, and that we as a discipline generally agree that this is a proper theoretical interpretation. And if we make a claim that says rising incomes are associated with democracy in some way, that we have some reason to believe this isn't just an association, but there's actually some causal relationship here. And it's very interesting when you think about this, because in any number of studies that perhaps have democracy as a dependent variable, income is certainly used as a covariate all the time. And then there'll be a footnote to Seymour Martin Lipset and a few other people over the past 50 years. And people will throw income in as a covariate. But if you actually read the current literature on income and democracy, the literature there's no center. Nobody agrees. They don't agree perhaps on how to conceptualize a dependent variable. They don't agree on what sorts of models to use to estimate this. They don't agree on what the results should be and how we should interpret the results. We have good reason to believe that there's a tremendous amount of spatial and temporal heterogeneity in the findings. For all sorts of reasons, I would be very uncomfortable saying that we know that income is a long-term cause of democracy. So I went through, in the white paper and in this paper, political economy arguments, political institutions arguments. I'm really quite fascinated by these arguments about constitutional engineering and whether we really know that, that we could take a situation that seems to be inhospitable to democracy and make it more conducive to democracy by writing the proper paper. Down the line, and thinking about this work as fairly as I could, I decided that those theories do not exist. That would have made for a shorter paper, so I kept on going down the list. Let's assume for a moment that such a theory existed. Would we know how to apply it in specific contexts, right? Because no one believes that an average, we'll be generous, we'll call it an average treatment effect. It's not an average treatment effect, it's a correlation, but call it that. We all know that averages cover up a great deal of variation. Would we know what had to be done in specific contexts? let's assume that we know that as well. We don't, but let's assume that we know that as well. A very important question is whether or not the relevant policymakers and practitioners would select our recommendation as what they wanted to implement. Given, and you can sit there on your own and think about all the different competing demands on the time of policymakers, their own ideological constructs, their own organizational investments, their own principal agent problems, their own deals on the side with Russian oligarchs. No, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that. For all sorts of reasons, we can't take the whole question of selection, even if we knew things right. And then finally, compliance. Right? Just think about this in the experimental term of never treats. Or do some people simply refuse treatment or act in ways that go against what the treatment is, and so on. I won't belabor the point. The mirrors from Prince's, that's a mirror that should be placed up in the attic and have a thick black shroud placed over it, and just bring it out when you want to do a horror movie or something like that. I don't think that we know very much. I tried to work the other way and just look at some literature that did some forms of policy evaluation, and I divided this up into the macro, the meso, and the micro level. I think the micro level is where what we did in this paper starts to intersect somewhat with what Jen and Tom and Irfan did in this paper. And once again, happy to talk to you about it in the Q&A, but as we go through all of these things, we find very few positive results at all. At the macro level, the idea that occupation-based change of democratic institutions can bring about any long-term democratic outcomes. There's simply no evidence for it whatsoever. At the meso level on election monitoring, it's a little bit more of a mixed bag. We can find some articles that give us some reason to believe that election monitoring can have some beneficial results. But then we find 5 more articles that say, but you know, would-be dictators act strategically and they choose their election monitors. It's election monitoring organizations have their own strategic interests. It's a mess. And finally, at the micro level, and here, the other paper would deal with it better, but we have some evidence that some programs do something. We just can't connect what they do to actual democratic outcomes. So I can give you some literature that says USAID programs that teach civic education make people more civic. Okay, can we show that this actually produces a different democratic outcome? And the answer is, of course not, because these projects aren't even designed. So I guess I don't have anything but a sober conclusion. First, is democracy promotion dead? Was it ever alive? So first, do no harm. It turns out we do a lot of harm in the world. We really do, and that's something I might consider that before we think about doing good in the world, we stop doing harm. But second, of course, physician heal thyself. If you don't know, Tomas Hendrik Ives was the president of Lithuania from 2008 to 2016, and this is what he tweeted out after he learned that the Senate had voted to refuse to allow witnesses in the impeachment trial. That great, we don't have to listen to the U.S. lecturing us about democracy promotion anymore. So maybe we have some work to do at our own homes first. Thanks very much for listening.
Oh, it's being controlled for me. It's kind of spooky. Hi, good afternoon. So Eric and I had the opportunity to work on the second phase of the project, which was about transitions from authoritarianism. And we had a lot of fun with this project because we got to time travel in our work back to a magical time when authoritarian regimes were collapsing and where countries were actually transitioning to democracy, and dictators were being thrown out of their palaces and statues of autocrats were being torn down, and we were all starry-eyed about the end of history. And political scientists were very interested in what was going on as well. We started writing volumes and volumes on a literature that became known as the transitology literature. I would hazard that it was probably the most productive sort of subfield within comparative politics for at least a good 20 years. We got to dig into that literature. Our report looks at 350, I think I counted, separate monographs, edited volumes, published and unpublished papers, to try to come up with some kind of synthesis in terms of our academic knowledge about why countries transition from authoritarianism. When we started this project, I think we maybe assumed, and we think there was perhaps an assumption from those who commissioned the project, that when we were talking about transitions from authoritarianism, we were talking about transitions from authoritarianism to democracy. And it quickly became clear to us that we couldn't just focus on transitions from authoritarianism to democracy, because statistically speaking, those were the sort of rare events. Usually it was transitions from authoritarianism to something more mixed, or transitions from authoritarianism to some other kind of authoritarianism, or a transition from authoritarianism to weak democracy back to authoritarianism. And so in approaching these 350 odd pieces of research that we looked at, which was of course only scratching the surface, we wish we had had more time to delve into things even more. We tried to synthesize this into 7 different what we called theory families. This was the literature that they asked us to this was the language that they asked us to use. And within these theory families, we were able to identify, I think it was about 30 different hypotheses, arguments that political scientists and social scientists generally had made about why countries transition from authoritarianism to something else. Just to preview, our findings aren't necessarily much more rosier than David and Ellen's. I think what we quickly found was first that on almost none of these hypotheses was there academic consensus. On almost every single one of them, some people argued one thing, some people argued another thing, and other people said, well, you can't find anything, null effects, right? And incidentally, on the few things where we were able to identify clear academic consensus, either it was extremely difficult to sort of operationalize that into something that practitioners could actually use, and in the few instances in which there were clear policy implications, the consensus seemed to be that whatever the U.S. was doing was wrong. And so and not just the U.S., the democracy promotion community generally speaking. And so as you can imagine, the folks at AID who commissioned the report were thrilled with what we presented to us. So we want to present it to them. So what we wanted to do was just to give you sort of a sense of how we approach this project and the level of discordance that we found in the literature. So it's not so much what do we know now, but what don't we know. The first theory family that we looked at was something we called political leadership. And this looked at sort of agency-based approaches rather than the famous structural approaches. Most of the approaches that we looked at are structural in nature. These looked at things like the personalities and choices that individual leaders made, idiosyncrasies of individual elites, right? So what happens when you get a Nelson Mandela running a country after a period of political reform versus a Robert Mugabe, for example, sends your country down different pathways. And then we also looked at that voluminous literature on that we refer to as distribution of power, right? What's the balance of power between the opposition and the incumbents? What's the balance of power within the government, within the authoritarian leadership in terms of hardliners versus reformers or softliners, right? And so looking at that literature, there seemed to be some academic consensus there that, yeah, elites can make some difference, right? But there's almost no attention in this literature to context, right? And so in terms of transferring this to actual policy recommendations, it was very hard to come up with a blanket, clear recommendation to people interested in democracy promotion other than try to find a Nelson Mandela or a George Washington or a Mahatma Gandhi, right? A second family that we looked at was even more broad, looked at structural factors related to political economy. And we would break this down, if my clicker will go ahead, there we go, into how political economy factors affect the preferences of the population and also leaders, and also those questions of balance of power that we talked about before. So here you would have literature that looks on how economic crises affect the stability and durability of authoritarian regimes, but also on the flip side, how economic performance affects the tools that autocrats have in terms of patronage, repression, in order to stay in power. We, of course, looked at modernization theory, everyone's favorite theory, and laid out how the academic literature treats that today, and, of course, the literature on inequality. And again, the general consensus here is that the economy is important. These kinds of factors do matter in terms of affecting populations' attitudes about the regime, in terms of affecting autocrats' tools that they can use. However, the evidence here is literally all over the place, right? Think about just the inequality literature, right? With some really good studies saying that equality makes it more likely that democracy is going to endure. Other literature talking about an inverted U-shape relationship, right? Other literature saying there's no relationship at all. In every single one of these sort of sub-families here in this broader theory family, there was absolutely no consensus. So if you're going to suggest, should people interested in democracy promotion do things that are going to grow the economy in order to promote democracy, there's no clear academic consensus. And so I think what we wrote in the report was, well, you should help grow the economy just because it improves people's standards of living, right? But we can say nothing about how that is going to, with any great degree of confidence about how that's going to affect political regimes. And finally, in terms of the families that I'm going to talk about here, we also talked about international factors, how external decisions and how policies and events that happen externally to countries affect regime trajectories. We focused on things like military intervention, which obviously the folks who were working in the US government were very curious about. This was one of those theory families in which the academic literature had a clear consensus on that this does not promote democracy, right? We looked at the literature on demonstration effects and how changes in one country can diffuse to other countries. Of course, going back to the economy, how do macroeconomic factors external to countries affect regime trajectories? And also the donors at AID were very interested in how external pressure or aid, which is something else that we looked at within that, how that affects likelihood of transitioning from authoritarianism and then a transition to a democracy. Again, consensus that international factors matter to some extent, but a lot of disagreement in the literature about why things are happening, right? So if we have clustering temporally and geographically in terms of regime transitions, does that mean diffusion is taking place or is something else going on? How do we even define diffusion, right? And also something that we consistently struggled with this literature is that people are often not even talking about the same thing, right? Sometimes people are talking about regime change broadly. Other times people are talking about state building. Other times people are talking explicitly about democratization or some kind of political liberalization. So that sort of conceptual argument is something that ran through our assessments of the literature as well.
Okay, so thank you for having me. Thanks to Dan and the center and everyone involved. I'm going to pick it up and take over the last 4 theory families. And the first one that I'm going to talk about, political culture, was probably the worst to work on because we just got into a lot of head-to-head discussions with the policy community about the value of political culture. And Jeff kind of alluded to this earlier, but one of the challenges is that there's already a lot of money dedicated to cultivating democratic cultures in different target states. So, you know, it's kind of an uncomfortable conversation to say, well, this doesn't work. But I think that the compromise was that we didn't say this doesn't work. We said that we don't have evidence that this works, but should you be able to test these things, it's possible there's a relationship. That's what it says in the text. Okay, so just to summarize, the basic idea here is that populations are going to react differently to the same forces, so that culture matters. And in the political culture literature, there's a variety of different specific cultural features that are emphasized. I listed a couple here. And from a practitioner's perspective, if there is evidence that culture matters and that having specifically pro-democracy values, let's say, or pro-democracy types of connections, if those things push countries away from authoritarianism, then the idea would be that you would devote resources to these things, which the government's already doing. Okay, so shaping popular orientations would be the key thing to emphasize. As you might guess, in our review of this literature, there was not that much support for these ideas. And I mean, the reality is that measuring political culture is really tricky. So a lot of times people do it through surveys, but the same survey questions might mean different things in different contexts. And there's also you encounter a number of problems with causality and establishing causality. So is it that being a democracy makes you have pro-democracy values? Which way is the arrow going? Okay, so the overall message that came out of this was that there really was not evidence that exists thus far that supports this idea that having specific cultural traits is going to push countries away from authoritarianism. And that was kind of a disappointing message, I would say, for the policy community. I actually think a number of people still don't believe us. But moving on, another hot button theory family was political institutions. And this literature is going to look at whether specific rules that are in place actually limit rulers' power in meaningful ways that could help constrain them and push a country towards a system where there's more accountability and so forth. And this literature the consensus in this literature is that these pseudo-democratic institutions in particular are very common in authoritarian regimes, which in some ways was a little bit of a surprise to the policy community, that most dictatorships actually hold multi-party elections and have legislatures and so forth. Where things kind of became interesting was in our discussions of how these seemingly democratic institutions influence the prospect of democracy. And one of the key messages that we tried to put across was that there are a number of studies that actually show that the adoption of these institutions is correlated with longer-lasting authoritarian rule. So, your gut instinct is going to be that, well, a country that's holding multi-party elections, a dictatorship that's holding multi-party elections, is going to be on a path towards democracy quickly because they're doing these things that we associate with democracy. Well, there are a lot of studies that debate each other in this literature, but all studies associate these things with longer-lasting authoritarianism. They get into debates over the causal pathways and all those other things that academics like to fight about, but that correlation is there. So this makes things very difficult because for practitioners, they observe that a country is on a path towards political liberalization by virtue of doing these things. But it is almost impossible to figure out whether that action of liberalization is part of some genuine effort to move towards greater democracy or is part of a savvy dictator's plan for survival. Okay, so I think I pretty much got into all of the basics with that one. The next theory family that we got into was triggering events. And these are going to be these specific events that are easily observable that have the potential to alter a regime's trajectories. These include things like protests, where suddenly you can see this catalyst for change, these cascade effects where citizens suddenly become more likely to make their preferences public. Coups, natural disasters, the end of civil war, and we also went through when leaders die of natural causes. Okay, so the idea here would be that events, these types of easily observable events can create opportunities for political change. And from a practitioner's perspective, if this is the case, then you would want to be able to mobilize resources quickly to help opposition groups in the face of these events. Now, in terms of the critiques of this literature, it's difficult to predict when some of these things are going to happen and what type of change they are going to cause. And one of the difficulties here is that in the academic literature, a number of studies don't actually look at democratization as the outcome. They look at regime collapse. So we know that natural disasters can elevate the chance of an autocratic regime collapse. But we don't know whether the new regime that emerges is going to be a democracy or a dictatorship. This makes things very tricky because if these events are creating an opportunity for change that puts a country on a path to dictatorship, then we should be cautious before trying to mobilize opposition efforts at the time. In terms of triggering events, there's some optimism here in that nonviolent protest movements in particular, there's quite a bit of evidence that nonviolent protest movements elevate the chance of a transition to democracy. So there is some optimism with that type of event specifically. And with the others, the probability of a regime change is higher during these moments, but you have to be very cautious in terms of which direction the country might make. Finally, we looked at state capacity. And here the idea, state capacity refers to how embedded and entrenched the state is in society as a very quick definition. And there are two kind of strands of the literature here that are very different. One is about sequencing and this idea that you might need to have a strong state prior to democracy. And then the other looks at state capacity and authoritarian durability more generally. The evidence is very mixed for the first strand. There is a lot of debate over how to measure state strength in these studies and so forth, and the dependent variable sometimes is different. In terms of the second theory, or second strand here, there is some evidence that stronger states lead to more durable autocracies. That said, should the country transition to a democracy, that democracy might be more robust. So again here, from a practitioner's perspective, the messages are very mixed. On the one hand, if you invested in strengthening the state, it could lead to a longer lasting dictatorship, but should that regime fall, then you might have a very long lasting democracy. Like with some of the messages coming out of the economy and building the economy, you could also consider the fact that strengthening state capacity might just be good for ordinary people in that, you might have better service delivery or more security from violence and so forth. But again, the messages are kind of mixed here. So, 300 and how many studies later? I have some takeaway points. Okay, in reviewing all of these different studies and in our conversations with the policy circle that we were talking with, it became clear that there are problems on both ends. From the perspective of academics, it was very frustrating that sometimes the takeaway message in the study really wasn't faithful to what the study was showing. And the measurement, how the dependent variable here is measured is really critical. A lot of times, the study would use a measure of, would use as the dependent variable something that was about political liberalization. So maybe the dictatorship becoming a little bit more liberal, more participatory, and so forth. But then the takeaway messages were that, we found that this affects democratization. That's not true, and that's not fair to the reader. Other difficulties came down to a lot of times studies were measuring regime collapse, but then it wasn't very obvious that they weren't very careful in terms of distinguishing between transition to a new dictatorship versus transition to a democracy. Okay, so how the dependent variable is measured matters, and we need to be very careful that what we say about our findings is actually faithful to how we measured things. From the practitioner's perspective, what looks like political liberalization may be authoritarian entrenchment. So you have to be very careful if you're going to, devote resources to these countries that allowed an opposition party to compete for the first time in elections. That may actually be a signal of strength, not of weakness. And, it's very difficult to disentangle these things. Also, the factors that encourage democratic consolidation may not have a democratizing effect in autocracies. And here I'm speaking almost directly to this political culture literature, where there are a lot of studies that, that are a little bit more stronger, that show that political culture matters for democratic deepening, but you can't necessarily just translate those to the authoritarian context. So those were some of our major messages. And, on some levels, you can share David's kind of doomsday take on these efforts. At the same time, I think some of it's on us in terms of providing clearer messages in our research. So I'm going to leave it at that and give you guys the floor.
So we hope everyone is still engaged, still alert. And I think the way the first two presentations have gone, hopefully will be a nice kind of wrap up, bringing it together. So we were tasked with the third phase of this project, which took a little bit of a change and focused primarily on the relationship between democracy and violent conflict. And this part of the project really is motivated by something that is fairly intuitive. When we look at and think about the countries in the world in sort of the last 5, 10, 20, perhaps even longer, 20 years longer, the relationship between conflict and democracy emerges. Many of the countries that are undergoing pressures for democratic transition are ones that are emerging from conflict. Many conflicts themselves result from the pressures of democratization or the sort of failure of less democratic or authoritarian modes of governance. And so in cases from Syria to Bangladesh to Colombia to Mozambique to Cambodia, El Salvador, Sierra Leone, Bosnia-Herzegovina, we see that there's a real tension between political stability and democratic politics. Since at least the early 1990s internationally, there's been an orientation towards democracy as being something of a solution to violent conflict. That if you could just get democracy right, the conflict would go away. This would be a way to transform social conflict out from the battlefield into the ballot box, and this sort of would make everybody happy and peaceful, and it would be great. But when we look at those cases in which democracy has been attempted as a solution to conflict, it turns out that many of them, here at least 5 out of 6, not counting our first 2 examples there are some real problems that emerge. This transition does not go smoothly in the vast majority of cases, whether it's sort of questionable support for a peace process or the results of a peace process as in Colombia, to a renewed insurgency 15, 20 years later in Mozambique, to the political tensions that we see in Bosnia over the last 5, 10 years really beginning to escalate. This doesn't go well most of the time. And so that's really the dilemma that motivates this phase of the project. So our phase was phase 3, was released in March of last year. And the report took a different approach. Rather than focusing on the theory families that organized the first 2 reports, we were more focused on the reciprocal relationships between political violence and democracy. We reviewed and summarized with our 3 fantastic research assistants who are not here. Can't say enough good things about them. Went through 600 sources, so we really tried to be comprehensive in this approach. And this yielded 35 hypotheses about the relationship between conflict and democratization, looking both at the ways in which democratization processes after major conflict can be problematic or might be successful, but also looking at the ways that the practice of democracy can generate generate or dampen various forms of political violence. And the report, in addition to these 35 hypotheses, included miniature case studies on El Salvador, Tunisia, and Libya. And then this all resulted in 6 general lessons regarding the state of our knowledge and democracy promotion. We, in this paper for this symposium, have tried to take sort of what was in the report and then use that as the basis for some thinking about what this all means for the health and the state of democracy promotion. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tom.
Thanks, Jen. And thanks to everyone for putting this together and for having us to Ann Arbor as a Michigan PhD. It's especially nice to be back home. So as Jennifer noted, we have three major questions in this report. Because we're interested in these reciprocal relationships, we're not just understanding what are the causes of backsliding or the causes of transitions from authoritarianism, but what are the reciprocal relationships between conflict and democratization or democratic practice. We sort of have 3 questions, and it was a little bit more of a complex report. First of all, under what circumstances do democratic practice or movements towards democracy change the risk of violent political conflict? And then under what circumstances does the risk and experience of that violent conflict change democratic practice? And then finally, what is it about democracy promotion that can either exacerbate these problems or hopefully make things a little bit better? And so that was sort of the basis of what we did in the report. In this paper, we actually have some good news to report. We're maybe the first ones, I think, of the 3 papers. We're going to say something nice, right, about USAID and democracy promoters more broadly. Since the early stages, and Eric and Jeff sort of got to this, you get to delve back about 25 or 30 years, and we were talking about the success of democracy promotion in a lot of these places. And only about like 10 or 15 years later, people were suddenly writing these doomsday, what happened to democracy promotion, only a few years after Fukuyama had written about the end of history. And there were some specific critiques made by scholars at the time that in a way that were really bringing to the fore some of the worries about democracy promotion, the state of democracy in the world. And the first is that we saw in a lot of cases, as Jen already pointed out, the failure of democratization in post-conflict countries. And that was interpreted oftentimes in a very pessimistic way. And Jennifer and Irfan and I separately have kind of written some of this work ourselves, right? That when you try to hold elections quickly in post-conflict countries, it tends to fall apart. That those elections tend to founder and don't produce stable democracy several years later. There's also kind of a sense that that democracy was very capable in weak contexts of fomenting more conflict. This is kind of most notable in a large literature that's really been growing in the last 10 to 15 years on election violence. That in new democracies, elections tend to feature a large amount of election violence. And so we believe, and what we argue in the paper, is that democracy promoters, not only in the United States, but around the world, have actually reacted to those criticisms made in many cases by scholars. And they've done so in a few different ways. First of all, they have moved their focus away from only elections to building the supportive infrastructure of democracy. I was lucky enough to attend a conference at the Carter Center a few years back, and the depth of discussion, the real intricate discussions about how to assist countries in doing all the things around elections that actually try to help build democratic practice is incredibly impressive. Democracy promoters have realized quite intensely that elections do not equal democracy, which we could have told them years and years ago, but they know that now, right? And that's really, really great. Some of the goals now are actually incredibly ambitious. Right? Democracy promoters are field testing methods to change voter attitudes, to kind of get to some of the questions of political culture that Jeff and Erica were bringing up. There are real methods out there to try to build civic awareness, build links of accountability between politicians and citizens, and real attempts to kind of change people's mindset about how democracy should work. And in a way, it's incredibly ambitious because it's a form of social engineering, and we shouldn't be shy about saying so. Right? This is a form of social engineering in support of a broader goal of democratization. And And that has meant, in times, this turn to a different kind of programming has meant focusing on more realizable goals, usually through the usage of field experimental methods that all the doctoral students in the audience and postdocs in the audience will know precisely what I mean, right? The ability to get funding to go into the field and field test in a small region of a country a civic awareness campaign, and then testing a few months later whether citizens are more fully informed about the actions of their representatives in parliament or in a bureaucracy somewhere. And those new methods have shown that we can really carefully specify, get away from all of the endogeneity problems that previous presenters have been talking about, and actually specify as specifically as possible what is the effect of doing a certain sort of program in a certain context. And there's been some good news from those studies that I'll talk about in a little bit, but this has been one of the new moves in democracy promotion, is to really field test as carefully as possible whether these programs have tactical victories on democracy promotion. And so one way to think about this is that democracy promotion has become more ambitious. Another way to think about it is that it's become more modest. Right? Sarah Bush has a really great book out in which she argues that democracy promoters have now shied away from really challenging structures of power in the places where they work. They're more focused on technical programs that they think make change at a lower level, tactical level in democratic practice. Now, that means that democracy promotion, to our mind, has become both more ambitious because of its attempts to change people's attitudes to reform institutions. On the other hand, more modest in the sense that it's not challenging broad structures of power and is more focused on tactical changes to how people actually practice democracy. To our mind, though, that new maturation that has kind of created some really interesting programming that has involved academics in the evaluation, which is a new exciting partnership between academia and the policy world, brings up two problems. I'll talk about the first one, and Jen will talk about the second. And that first problem is what we're calling the levels of analysis problem in the paper. There's this new focus then on what we call tactical success. Does police reform shift citizen trust in the state? Does it make people more likely to actually take disputes into the legal system as opposed to solving them with more traditional means or resorting to violence? Do civic education programs increase citizen participation? Do they increase legislator accountability, right? Doing at a very granular level, finding out whether these programs actually work. And there's some really exciting stuff going on there. We could go on and on and on. Like Jen said, 600 sources. We could go on and on and on. There's encouraging news then about these tactical successes, right? A lot of these studies are showing, and I don't think this is only a file drawer problem, right? I think a lot of interesting studies are showing that some of these programs really work when they're tested. But that kind of brings up three related challenges. The first is we don't know whether tactical successes lead to strategic success. It's incredibly hard to tell whether if we increase voter accountability or voter information, whether that is going to bleed up into real change in democratic practice. We don't know if it does that in a sort of from an indicator level to a component level of democracy. We don't know if it does it across time. We don't know whether the effects stay, and then we don't know whether effects going upward actually will stick too. So if voters are actually more educated 5 years after a program's done, which by the way, we never test, right? But even if we could trust that voters are gonna be more informed 5 years later, is that fundamentally gonna change the accountability relationship with their representatives? And will that change flow even farther up into real change in, say, a country's democracy score or in broader patterns of democratic governance? We just don't know because you can't test that with an experiment. And so we don't know. And then you get into the land that previous presenters were talking about, where we're dealing with a lot of endogeneity. We don't know whether these things work. We don't know in the broad scheme of things. We're doing these cross-national comparisons now, and it's hard to really tell. That's the work I do, and trust me, it's incredibly hard to do. The other thing we don't know is how conflict might be conditioning how these relationships work. There's really interesting work. You were mentioning before, David, right? So, how do we apply knowledge in specific contexts? And the fact is that when we use these experimental methods in the way that we have been and really field test democracy promotion, one of the things that we don't really know about is how the experimental results that we get change across contexts, and conflict is one of the major contexts. We know that something like a quarter of elections around the world held today are held in either a country currently experiencing violent political conflict or within about 10 years of one. Right? So what we know is that democracy promotion probably is working in fundamentally different ways in countries without such experience versus countries with such experience. But we don't precisely know how those things go across countries. And so one of the things that we really impress upon in the report is that conflict is a major contextual factor. And kind of one other report on the literature recently shows, by Michael Finley, shows that we actually know very, very little about whether democracy aid actually contributes to peace building in post-conflict countries, or conflict management, or conflict prevention. Right? The results are just all over the place. And so whether these techniques are working in conflictual societies is something we really don't know. Now, Jen will pick up the last point.
And we don't know not only for problems of measurement, right? This is not just the limit, it's not meant to be exclusively a critique of the limits of experimental evaluation. We don't know because democracy promotion is not just a technical endeavor, right? It's political. And its end goals are political. And anytime that is true, it's going to run up against really fundamental questions of power and the distribution of power and these power structures that we've been talking about, in some ways directly or indirectly all afternoon. And this presents a few different issues. First, this problem, while certainly not unique to the post-conflict context, I think the authors of all three studies have run up against this in their reviews of the literature. Violent conflict creates a context that is somewhat different. First, because it empowers violent actors. Many of the key actors in post-conflict elections, in post-conflict democratic politics, to the extent that they're democratic, got there via violence. They got there because they were good at violence. And one of the things that I think the literature does suggest is that those legacies shape the capabilities that those actors have. They shape their commitment to democratic politics. There's a huge literature on rebel-to-party transitions, and one of the things that comes out of that is some of the more contemporary literature emphasizes that this is not an either-or, right? This is not a violence or electoral campaigns choice, that parties continue to use both, just in different mixes. And so because of that, efforts to move towards the sort of nice, pretty rainbows and unicorn version of democracy that we think about on paper sometimes requires actors to move away from the very bases of power that put them where they are and maintain them where they are. And that's a really big ask. You're not just asking elites to constrain themselves in those contexts, you're asking them to abandon the fundamental sources of power that they have. And this is kind of problematic and hard to do. In some of the more classic versions of theorizing around this, we expected voters to serve as the arbitrator of this. Voters were expected to be the sort of pro-peace arbiters of political conflict between these violent elites. But the literature on polarization and sort of examining the pro-social hypotheses that we have suggests that voters don't actually do that. Right? They do have a bias towards peace. They do want peace and stability, but their understandings of what stability is and what would get it for them it's refracted through the narratives that are told by these powerful actors that have kind of captured power through these processes. So we can't rely on elites necessarily to be pro-democracy and just constrain themselves out of nowhere. We also can't necessarily, even if you had the institutional setup right, can't necessarily even rely on voters to be the constraining power to avoid a return to conflict. And one of the sort of corollaries of this is that in the post-conflict context, democratic politics really operates at higher stakes. Not only do you have these potentially violent actors engaging in politics, but the risk of losing an election is much, much higher, right? Where you have these legacies of conflict and mistrust, the risk that if you lose the election, you will be persecuted by your opponent is much more salient and much higher in these contexts than in many others. So power here is operating on many levels, all of which are problematic. Which we could end there, right? We could sort of be pessimistic and say there's no point, maybe this is all a waste of resources. But there is a potentially more optimistic note on which to end. And that is that violent conflict creates opportunities for democracy promotion. Violence cracks structures of power. And as the previous presenters noted, we can't necessarily say what comes out of that. That is not deterministic. Just because you have a breakdown in these power structures doesn't mean you're going to get something more democratic out of it. But that could present opportunities for well-judged choices around democracy promotion programming. One of the areas of the literature that has highlighted this is the literature on women's empowerment during conflict that has suggested that the processes of armed conflict can create networks and break down norms of pre-existing patriarchies that might allow women to do things like increase their representation in the legislature. The downside to this is the second wave of that literature highlights that what exactly that means in terms of changing the fundamental power structure is much more ambiguous, right? That these changes run up against other considerations of power, sort of from the elite level or from other social forces, that mean that just because there's a crack in the power structure doesn't determine what's going to come out of it at the other end. Now, that again doesn't necessarily have to be the end of the story. There is space, we argue in our paper, for pairing these sort of tactical successes at the programming level with diplomatic leverage and diplomatic pressure that could then change the incentive structures of elites to incentivize them to not get in the way of some of these changes, to not counteract some of these more lower level, perhaps micro level changes. Unfortunately, when we look around the world right now, we don't necessarily see democracy promotion being prioritized at a diplomatic level. It doesn't seem to be leading the pack in terms of the foreign policies of many former democracy promoters. And so we're not optimistic that this is where we are right now, but we are hopeful that it is where we could be in the future.
Thanks to everybody for the presentation. I'd say we make one quick intervention before we open it up. I was thinking, especially during the last presentation, about these scale problems, and the idea of democracy promotion seeming so grandiose. And I was thinking about how, economists have this clear divide between microeconomics and macroeconomics. Yeah. And for all of the political scientists think economists, lump too many things together, they're too ambitious. We actually lack that. And that maybe sometimes we should be more aware of, when we're talking about macro level phenomena, whether we're actually, the evidence we collect or our theories are more about micro level phenomena. It might be kind of interesting to think through how that might improve some of our arguments. But we have about 45 minutes, so if anybody has questions.
Thank you very much for this fascinating panel. I learned a lot. I teach democratic erosion, so I wish I had shipped all my students here. So I have two questions. Yeah, one is conceptual, and the other is methodological. So my conceptual question is, while I agree that liberalization doesn't mean democratization, and democratic erosion doesn't mean democratic breakdown or collapse, but to play the devil's advocate, right, this conceptual difference really depends on what we mean by democratization or transition. And it assumes that the difference between authoritarian regimes and democracies is qualitative instead of quantitative. So for instance, when we say democratization, do we mean going from authoritarianism to a liberal democracy or electoral democracy, and where is the cutoff point? And if this difference is qualitative, because that is why liberalization doesn't mean democratization at a smaller scale, then why is our measurement quantitative, right? Why do we use polity scores and so on and so forth, and put basically the regimes on the same scale? And then my methodological questions is, so to what extent is this lack of academic consensus on certain questions driven by the sociology of publishing. And that something, especially with large N, that's something that disagrees with prominent literature is more likely to get published. And with experiments is different because people are using different treatments and rarely use the same data set. And therefore, you rarely see replication with the exact same treatment or exact same subjects because it's much less likely to get published unless you really want to, take a prominent research down. And also it's the lack of if you find null hypothesis, so it's hard to publish that. Then there is kind of this universe, even with experiments, a universe of findings of null hypotheses that might not be considered in these lit reviews. So have you thought about in your research kind of robustness checks that you might do on your lit review? Like looking at literature only employing large N or separating qualitative case studies from quantitative research and so on and so forth. So, thank you.
I'll go ahead and.
Yeah, please.
Am I on? Okay. So for your second question, those are very good points. And yeah, the way that publishing works does not always incentivize us getting out the messages that we might want. I will say in terms of the types of studies that we looked at, one of my big fears was that because I tend to look at cross-national quantitative work, that I was only going to be familiar with those studies. One of the positives of the way that USAID set it up was that you were required to get these experts to come weigh in on these think sessions, and they really pushed us hard to get experts who did not have substantial overlap with what our own research was. So I felt a little bit more relaxed that we had some more qualitative people involved who would be able to flag certain studies. But I mean, in terms of the publishing issues and not being able to publish a null result and so forth, totally valid point. For the first question, I have, one of my fatal flaws is I am very rigid about what democracy is. And so to me, if you have a free and fair election, you have a democracy. And I don't like getting bogged down in bringing other things into the definition because I think it makes it very difficult to then test theories. People disagree with me about this all the time. But I don't tend to differentiate between liberal democracy, electoral democracy, because usually my outcome of interest is just the transition, which I measure on the date of a free and fair election. So one of the positives of that approach, there are negatives to the approach to all of these approaches, right? And I always say, well, the way that you measure things needs to be based on the question that you're interested in asking. And most of my questions are about whether something leads to regime change or democratization more generally. So one of the things I tend to say is that, one of the messages that has come out of research comparing democracies and dictatorships using this type of binary message is that there are a lot of good things that happen in democracies, things that are normatively good. So we know using these binary, cutting off the world in these two categories, that there are, fewer genocides in a democracy. There are fewer human rights violations. So, there's a mixed bag in other areas that we might care about. But in some big ones, I think you could say, yeah, I'd rather live in places where they have a free and fair election than in those where they don't. But again, I think there's validity to different perspectives. It's based on what you're interested in. In terms of my review of the literature, I'd say I'd rather live in a place where it's a free and fair election, but I'll leave it at that.
So the one thing that I would add, at least to the first question, in terms of if we think of democracy, the differences between democracy and authoritarianism as being qualitative, why are we measuring them in quantitative senses? The one thing I would say is I think we're actually doing a lot better on that front over the last sort of 5 to 10 years. I would say in terms of scholars, probably in reacting to just this issue, having much more concrete dependent variables, much more sort of meso-level outcomes that they're examining. And I think that a big driver for this was really the emergence and sort of flourishing of the hybrid regimes literature, right? The recognition that the institutional form is not in and of itself enough. Like, you can't just look at the parchment institution. And so from that perspective, I would say, yes, I agree. I think that there is space in the sort of social endeavor that is political science for studies that are using some of those kind of big aggregate variables. But overall, I actually see promising trends in the literature towards more nuance as another sort of part of the endeavor.
Let me just say one more thing on this. So I've always been very attracted to dichotomous, qualitative, categorical notions of democracy and dictatorship. I think they coincide more with most of our theoretical intuitions. I don't really think we have any theories that say as wealth increases, the politics score should increase by 0.7, 0.5 points if you're more than one standard deviation from the mean on income levels, et cetera. And indeed, even if you look at most of the quantitative measures, this is not true for VDEM as much, but certainly Polity and Freedom House, there's always, some effort to dichotomize it afterwards, right? So we all know that polity is, at the end of the day, if you're above 6, you're a democracy, and if you're below 6, you're not. And so the last thing to say about things like polity is no one knows what these numbers mean, right? We have these multidimensional components, and we reduce it to a scalar. And so, as any number of people have pointed out, you could point to regimes that seem radically different from each other, but all have a 5, for example. And if you move from a 5 to a 4, no one knows what that means. So I've always been polity. But then I started thinking about democratic backsliding or reading the New York Times, and it gets complicated, right? Because there are changes taking place, say, in Turkey, that I don't think violate my qualitative notion of whether, or at some point in time, was it democracy or not, but that clearly are a reduction in the quality of the democracy and are clearly intentionally brought about by actions of executives, et cetera. Or if I look at America today, and I don't know if you guys have these internal conversations or external conversations, how would we know if America stopped being a democracy? What exactly would, given the sorts of dynamics we think are going on, there's not going to be a military coup, but there's going to be a point where we think we've crossed some threshold. There's no longer significant accountability. There's no longer significant participation because significant numbers of the population have been excluded from voting, et cetera. And I don't really have an answer for this, but I find myself more and more trying to figure out how to square that circle to maintain a qualitative categorization, but also recognize that we need to be able to talk about what happens within the categories. On the question of sociology and knowledge, the thing that drives me more than anything else is we don't spend anywhere near enough time interpreting coefficients. We just don't talk about what they mean. P-values are everything, even though no one thinks p-values are anything. I will do my best as a member of the departing generation to smash the temple of the p-value so that you guys don't have to deal with this bull stuff. But it's just a terrible, terrible way to determine who gets published, who doesn't get published, and it makes it very difficult to determine whether we've actually learned anything or not. So I agree with you completely on that point.
Yeah, I would also wonder, if to the extent we have these pathologies of the academic publishing industry, in the spirit of thinking about how we get academics and policymakers talking to each other, which of course is the spirit of this, you have to wonder if we should have a different track, almost different tracks of how things get published, or just in some ways that's not only through the academic peer review, where again, surprise, mixed findings are really valued, to really think about there could be some way that the kind of research we do could be more targeted toward answering questions where the null finding, the consistent finding is not in some way deprioritized or punished. So you have to think about whether we might need some new institutions, new outlets or something. But
adding on to that, this is an area where I do think perhaps there's baby steps in the right direction with the whole, movement for pre-registration of plans and reviews that are done before the findings are presented to the reviewers. However, when we have made steps in those directions, right, with like EGAP's Medicaid initiative, for example, some of the findings that the last presenters put forward, right, are not so rosy, right? A lot of these field experiments, as you pointed out, do not replicate, right, either within the same context or across or across the context. And I think what we're struggling with is this an issue of context, is an issue of learning, right? That elites can respond to changes within the population or changes in institutions that are caused by these tinkerings that we are pairing up with policymakers and doing, and sort of everything comes back to that equilibrium point. So I think we're getting better as a profession. I just don't know if we're learning that much.
But Jeff, to take up that point, it's also a theoretical question, and I think one thing that we're still doing rather poorly. I mean, if you look at the varieties of democracy data, right, they're incredibly granular and detailed about different elements of democratic practice, and that's a really, really good thing. But we don't theorize about elements of democratic practice. We theorize about democracy.
Yeah,
right.
The micro macro difference. I'm
This is the
talking
micro
about,
macro,
right?
And so we don't. I don't. Maybe I don't know it, but 350, 600, how many sources we've all read, right, or our RAs had to read. Are there specific theories of the development of media freedom?
Yeah.
There might be some out there, but I don't know them. And so what happens is that we theorize about this multidimensional whole. So I think actually the biggest distinction isn't, are we thinking in categories or along a continuum? It's that we're not thinking in multiple dimensions, which, by the way, I can't do. I'm not smart enough to. But we're not thinking in these multiple dimensions. And because we don't theorize specifically in that way, it makes it really, really hard to make sense of results that actually may not be confusing if we can be more theoretically creative. So there's a really, really great study by Richard Sexton, right, in which he found that when you did an experimental study in Peru to try to make voters hold legislators, I think, more accountable, right, and it raised their expectations for what legislators should do. What ends up happening is that then a little bit farther down the line, the treated voters were a lot more likely to believe that taking to the streets, sometimes violently, is a good way to get attention. Right? But this is straight out of Ted Robert Gurr, right? That's sort of raising expectations without raising the actual results, right, is going to make people frustrated. That rising frustration is going to lead to potential violence, right? So that's one of these things where I'm like, so how is that? It might be empirically confusing, but it's theoretically pretty clear, right? And so I think because we don't do really good theorizing about how these elements, how these multiple dimensions intersect with each other, results look confusing that shouldn't be confusing.
Hi, I had a question that you started off with the kind of this issue of the experiments and the micro experiments as being sort of a positive thing. And so I've been working on external validity, and so this has come up now a couple of times. And so I was kind of curious. I've been working on this for a while and talking to Mike Finley the last couple of years about this as well. So I was also partially curious, how does USAID think about this? Like, I prefer to use the term generalization, so if they think it works in setting A, where do they think it might be likely to work or not work, or how do they have an implicit sort of theory of external validity, or how? I'd just be curious to hear more about that particular dimension. I obviously it arises in other settings, but you sort of specifically brought it up. So I was just kind of curious about that, a little bit, maybe the sociology about how, like the Mediketa project, if you go and look online, when they talk about external validity, it's just a bunch of generalizations and platitudes, for example.
I feel like I should be the person to answer this, but I'm not sure. Since I'm the person who brought up, I'd like to point out I think experiments are good things, and I think identifying causal effects is a good thing. But as for kind of, we've all had a chance to spend a lot of time with people from USAID because of the nature of the project. And actually, before I did this project, I had been a fellow at this conflict management mitigation office at USAID, which is get a drink in me, and I'll tell you some good stories. But I think I'm not sure USAID has, or individual people at USAID have a theory in their head, right? Many of them have been to multiple parts of the world for kind of maybe a few weeks here and a few weeks there, and some of them have been program officers, some of them are more DC based. And so I have found that in a lot of cases, a response you'll get from program officers in particular is, but that's not true in place I've been for a long time, right? So they have a good sense of the lay of the land in the place where they've spent a lot of time. And so then have a sense of sort of, well, that would work or that wouldn't work in that context. Yeah, I think that's it. I think it's induced from decisions, but I don't think there's an active sort of conceptual discussion within the agency that says, how do we actually think through whether certain types of programming are going to work, to take sort of, or work in different contexts. To take David's point from earlier, right? Even if we knew what works and we knew how to apply it in different contexts, would the sociology and the power politics of place allow us to adopt what works in specific contexts? And in a lot of cases, I think a lot of USAID people feel like they're completely kind of at the, I want to say this carefully, that a lot of the things aren't up to them when it comes time to sort of actually implementing which policies in which places.
Can I add on to that? I don't get the sense that there's a lot of policymakers out there who are like, well, this particular strategy worked in Peru to accomplish what we wanted. Therefore, we can just apply it everywhere, and therefore it's completely generalizable. And this isn't particular to AID, but it seems that there's so much emphasis now on non-governmental organizations, other development agencies not related to the United States, that they all want to have an M&E component, right? And increasingly, a crucial part of that M&E component is usually some kind of field experiment, right? And there isn't enough discussion about the findings about what worked in this particular intervention in this setting when it was done by this particular CSO, right? I think there needs to be some kind of a greater clearinghouse for discussions of significant findings, and also coming back to this null findings thing. So it's almost the opposite. I don't presume to speak for AID, but there's almost not enough generalization going on.
Well, since we lifted the veil a little bit here and we're talking about things at USAID, I wonder if anyone could speak at all to the question of morale and to the question of purpose.
It's low.
Yeah.
Just say that.
Yeah. Well, because when I was at the consulting, the session we did in D.C., it was right after the last election. Yeah. And at that moment, it was like a Secretary of State had not been named yet. And so Tillerson hadn't been named. And so there was this real sense of dormancy or kind of limbo. But I just wonder if there's any sense that you get from people that the work that we do is work that is still going to have value and be valued, and or is there a sense that this gets to the question of the death or otherwise of democracy promotion? I mean, did you get a sense? So it's low, but there's kind of low and fighting, and there's low and giving up, or I mean, just
I have a small sample here, but my impressions are that they're beyond the staffing issues where there's all these holes, that it's low because it's not really that prioritized, and you kind of got at that at the end of your talk. So I have a colleague who works in for the government, and she said, you need to write a paper that convinces policymakers that democracy is good, because they don't really know why they should care about it anymore, which is a big reversion from where we were earlier. And I thought about it, and do we really need to sell this idea? But apparently, that's another reason why morale is low, is that within the government, there doesn't seem to be much value placed on democracy promotion right now, from my impressions. And that's just my impressions, but.
Thanks.
So I actually would jump in on this question a little bit, and I can't necessarily speak to sort of USAID exclusively, but in sort of the other half of my job, I'm the Associate Director of the Democracy and Governance MA program at Georgetown, and we are the training ground for democracy promoters in a lot of ways. And one of the things that I would highlight in this area, if we want to talk about democracy promotion broadly, like USAID is sort of the gorilla in the field, but they're not alone. So if we want to talk about democracy promotion, in many cases the money might flow through USAID, but they're not the only ones there. So the National Endowment for Democracy, for example, is on a hiring tear. right now. They just got funding for a whole bunch of positions. And so I think there's a disconnect in some ways between sort of the policymakers, particularly on the executive side, and the appropriators on the Hill. And who values democracy and how much money should be going for it. I think there's a real disconnect there right now, which is disheartening, is my impression for a lot of folks, especially at USAID, but hasn't totally killed the professional field. So I would say that I think if you take a slightly broader viewfinder, it's gray, but it's not all black.
I do think that there was at least my second day at USAID as a fellow I couldn't go to work because of the inauguration. Right, so because no one could get to the Wilson Building in downtown DC because it's right on Pennsylvania Avenue where the parade route takes place, and the one thing I was really struck by, and this is a good time to say that none of us speak for USAID, right? Though we receive funding from USAID, none of us speak for USAID. Our opinions do not reflect the opinions of USAID or IIE. But what I will say is I think there was sort of this kind of shock and disbelief in the early days of the current administration. The appointment of, and I'm forgetting his name now, the director of USAID, steadied things a little bit. I palpably noticed that people relaxed and said, "Oh, the president didn't name a nut to be the head of USAID," and there was a little bit of kind of an exhale there. The appropriators have acted pretty strongly to protect the USAID budget, and so some of the sort of most nightmare scenarios of what funding for that particular agency would look like didn't materialize. But there is a difference, as Jennifer's pointing out, between appropriations and the general morale. And I think the general morale is still one of the, it's like the EPA during a Republican administration, right? No one's really happy, right? And there is a sense that our issues are not the most important issues for the executive right
now. Thanks for this really interesting talk. I think one of the trends in the world that we've seen in the last couple of years is that countries are also less receptive to programs like, or general democracy promotion programs. I work on the former Soviet Union. Most of the countries that I work on don't work with USAID or NED or any of those organizations. And as far as I know, Russia is also interested in supporting any country who wants to kick them out as well. So I was wondering if you could comment on that that trend, and also on another point that's come out a little bit in the talks, which is this sort of tension between democracy promotion is inherently good because democracy is just inherently better than not democracy. Yet also a lot of the things that we think might contribute to democracy or the things that we're doing are just nice for people who live in these countries. Like Erica pointed out, that you'd rather live in democracy than not democracy, but unfortunately, most people don't get to pick. So, things like economic improvements, some of the political culture programs, that those can have positive impacts on the people who live there, even if they don't directly in a verifiable way where we can replicate them elsewhere, contribute to democratization. So I'm wondering how that fact affects how we think about what an organization like USAID or sort of these international organizations should be doing in general in the world.
I don't know what they should be. I mean, I support this idea, and yet even though we come out of this saying I don't know what you should do, I guess part of me feels like things would be better suited if they were tailored towards places that already were democracies but are weak democracies. I mean, I don't know what your review of that literature would say. We don't have that many studies necessarily that look at those things, but then you're not having to deal with this will issue of whether they will accept these resources. So that's one side of it. And then in terms of the quality of life side, we're all sympathetic to, hey, this could be good for ordinary people. It's not going to necessarily mean that they get to vote in ways that are meaningful. But, sometimes you'd rather have bread on the table than get to select who your leadership is, right? The thing that was tricky was that, what we were tasked with was looking specifically at whether these things would lead to paths away from authoritarianism, however it was put. And, you know, we don't know if this is going to lead them out of authoritarianism. So if they change their goal to, like if the goal of the project is, you know, how do you improve ordinary people's lives, it's a separate issue, right?
The thing I would add to that discussion, I think Eric is right. So there's a big literature out there, none of which we actually treat in these reports, right, about sort of the positive socioeconomic impacts of democratization. And there's been sort of some powerful evidence, especially on but less on economic growth per se, right, where the economists are just, very much doubtful of the economic impacts of democracy, but on the sort of general kind of social goods side, so education, life expectancy, under 5 mortality, things like that, these kind of pluses that lead Erica to make that conclusion. I think one thing that's interesting to note, though, is that when we think about what Huntington called the third wave, right, of democracy that happens, starts to happen, by the late 70s, if you want to talk about sort of Greece or Spain or Portugal, right, and then spreading into Latin America in the early 1980s, and then to Eastern Europe and just a little bit later, is that it coincided with a cutting of the state. And it's something that we kind of don't think about. It essentially coincided with the debt crisis, lost decade of growth in Latin America, right? Everyone knows this history. I don't have to repeat it. And it's one thing that sort of Irfan and I actually argue in our book, is that democratization happened in a lot of places at the exact same time that the IMF was saying, and IMF has corrected itself on this later. It's sort of kind of begrudgingly admitted that it was giving bad advice, right? But at the exact same time that the IMF was saying, you better start cutting your social spending. And so the impact of cutting the size of the state at the precise time that democracies are being instantiated in a number of places limited incumbents' ability to do all the stuff that we think incumbents are supposed to do, right? Win the election by providing public goods and building bridges and clinics and all that sort of stuff. Their ability to do that is more circumscribed now than it used to be. If you just look at sort of taxation per head, right, in real terms, it's declined over time, not increased in virtually everywhere than North America and Western Europe. And so there's I have real doubts about Erica's argument. I think she's still right? That sort of, it's better to live in a democracy than not a democracy, right? But the question is, if we're sort of taking sort of these sort of eras, right? I think we're in an era now where incumbents in a democratic country may have their instincts in the right place. They're finding it very, very hard to show to voters that democracy is actually working for them, right? And so I think that is highly problematic for how we think of sort of democratization in these contexts.
But I think of the couple points that Erica was making there. So one about whether democracies just do better in general, but I think this other point you made really, I think, follows very nicely from the discussion of the panel and from the question that was just asked, which is this idea of focusing these initiatives more on countries that are democracies and where the question is sustaining it. So in a way, thinking about the David Ellen report on backsliding more than pathways out of, there might be more lessons in that report because, as Sasha's question indicates, receptivity is an issue, right? This came up in your presentation as well, David, right? So you have to have this question of receptivity. And then to the extent that we think that these more micro-level, tactical rather than strategic initiatives make more sense, you could imagine sort of a 2x2 of macro versus micro, and then thinking about whether existing, at least procedural democracies versus non-democracies, that odds are that you're probably more likely to have more confidence in the kind of interventions you'd have in the more micro and in the more existing democracies. Again, based on the conversation we ourselves had, not just our intuitions, but I think that seems to be coming out of the discussion too.
But, also here, I guess I'd want to encourage more people to think in terms of not just average treatment effects, but local average treatment effects, right? Because we might be able to say something about the compliers who would not do things if there were no promotion, but would do things if there were promotion. But there are all these, I'm always struck by the never treats. You're not going to send a USAID mission to North Korea. So enough. I guess in general, we think a lot about, sort of run-of-the-mill omitted variable bias or selection bias, but maybe not quite enough about endogenous selection bias. The other thing is, for a lot of programs, you can point to benefits to people in host countries, but it's a select group of people who often benefit. And, anyway, I don't really...
Can I add one point to your question? I mean, you're right. We do see this trend of authoritarian regimes clamping down specifically on foreign-funded, whether it's by governments or by civil society organizations, right? And it's not just in the former Soviet Union; it's all across Africa, right? And there's often this sort of nationalistic kind of we have to keep foreign influence out of our domestic politics, right? Argument, but we've just been most of us have been making these arguments, right? That all of these things don't work, right? But these authoritarian leaders, based on what they're doing here, it seems to suggest that they think it might work. Otherwise, why would they be so fearful of what all these initiatives are doing? I hadn't thought about that until you raised that question. So maybe everybody's wrong here, or maybe.
But also, I mean, underscoring the point, this didn't really come up except elliptically in David's presentation, but the issue of democracy promotion being a little bit of a spoiled brand in the sense of its association with the Iraq War, which, of course, the ultimate example of democracy promotion being used for macro purposes on an existing authoritarian regime. So again, might be part of what the rethinking needs to be done is that maybe of some types and some quadrants, the democracy promotion has to be, extricated from those kinds of practices too, to regain any kind of legitimacy, receptivity too. So, questions?
Well, you've given us a lot to chew on. Presentations were excellent. But I would like to have heard from political scientists from India or from Iran or from East Germany. I think those people might have something very fruitful to contribute to the discussion here. And I have a couple other thoughts. First of all, when the United States is trying to manipulate nations toward democracy, the main contact that the people in those countries have is with our corporations and our military, which are the most autocratic organizations that we have in our culture. The NGOs may give them a little exposure to democratic processes, but they are certainly not as important in the nations where the United States has really tried to intervene. Thirdly, I wonder what you think about the way nations handle information, whether their treatment of journalists is an important factor in whether democratization can occur.
We can also collect a few if there are other hands. I think Natalia has a question. Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much for the panel. I have, I think, a pretty broad question, because the lesson that I'm getting from this panel is that we have a wealth of empirical data. We have studies on pretty much anything related to democracy promotion. But despite of that, we actually don't have a very good theory. We don't have any consensus. And I'm not quite sure why. And my question is, why is it so difficult to theorize democracy and democratization? Because if we think about, just social sciences in general, other areas of social sciences aren't nearly as contradictory. When sociologists study social inequality, yeah, there are some contradictions, but generally it's a pretty consistent tradition, pretty consistent literature. But that's not the case with the studies of democracy. Do you think there are some systemic general reasons why we can't wrap our heads around it? Or it's, I don't know, just inherently difficult and we're making baby steps in the right direction? Thank you.
Yeah, great.
Sure. Thanks a bunch for this really interesting panel. I've learned a lot from reading the reports, and it was nice to see them presented today. So I have a question about this tension between kind of the maturation of democracy promotion programs towards more tactical successes or realizable goals, and this aggregation problem, which is that we don't know whether micro-level changes aggregate up towards democratization. So this seems really important to me, and I want to push you to think kind of more about the implications of what that means. So I want to resolve the tension. One way to do that would just be to kind of moderate my expectations. Okay, fine, I don't know whether these programs will aggregate up to democratization in the long term, but that's fine because they have good short-term impacts that are tangible that I can measure. So who cares whether they produce democratization later? That's one I think, defensible position. But if we give up on democratization as a goal for some of these programs, does that undercut the rationale for the programming from the U.S.'s strategic perspective? So Erica's comment earlier about how policymakers don't know why they should care about democracy anymore seems really on point. You know, from their perspective, if we're not getting democratization, what are we getting? And I'd be very curious to hear what the panelists think about that.
You want to jump in?
So in some ways, I think the answers to the last two questions are related. I think one of the reasons why we lack such consensus in the field of democracy studies, well, I think there are two reasons. One, we have, as Tom pointed out, we have a whole bunch of theory going back to the 50s and 60s and arguably back to Kant about democracy as an aggregate, right? We have a bunch of theories about democracy as an aggregate. And it turns out that as an aggregate concept, it has a whole bunch of component pieces that don't always move in the same direction. So those theories, maybe not always super helpful. We could then make a full shift and start only theorizing about the component pieces, right? So media freedoms, civic engagement, political participation. We could focus there. And I think that would be a good step, but they are complementary, right, these pieces. And that's why democracy, to the extent that it is a 0-1, right, to the extent that you have it or you don't, it's because they're mutually dependent in some way. And so I think just the task in that sense is really hard. And I won't pretend to speak with authority on how that compares to other fields of study in our discipline. But I think we shouldn't underestimate the challenges of that task. And so that gets to, I think, some of the aggregation challenges. I think we need to tackle that issue and thinking much more deeply about what we think aggregation would look like. What that would mean for sort of a program that succeeds in one place but maybe doesn't succeed in another, the sort of the problem of external validity. That to me it's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity, right? We could think much more coherently and much more deeply about why it is that those programs might not travel or those effects might travel. And that might be the source of hypothesizing towards this effort at a much more complex but coherent theory. And one of the things that I think I would hope would hold as an implication of our paper is that you can't just do the experimental work. You need to embed that within a larger ecosystem of research that is going to allow us to move in this direction for precisely these reasons. And I think that you need to be self-conscious about that because of the importance of being able to preserve the sort of policy rationale for this work.
Jump in. I just want to clarify. I think we know a lot about democratization, but I don't think we know that many things that policymakers could do to encourage it, which is very different. So, I mean, we all know if you were going to do a model of democratic transition, you know exactly what variables you're going to control for because they repeatedly, well, I guess we couldn't assess causality in all instances, but there are some major things we do know. We just don't know necessarily about like, well, this is what you would do if you wanted to promote it there. So it's slightly different. And then I would also say that I get very nervous with, if something is going to influence something smaller, and you guys talked about it earlier, it makes me very nervous that those very same things are going to keep that same terrible government in power for longer. So there's always this like big risk of, well, okay, but what is that going to lead to later? It just makes me nervous. So, yeah.
On the aggregation challenge, which I thought was like beautifully put in the last presentation, right? Yes, I would like to think that maybe informing some kind of intervention that results in a better informed population, even if it's only a small way, is inherently like a good thing, right? And maybe we can just leave it at that. But it is important to study how these other actors are going to respond to that. And something that is a small positive in one way may actually create all of these sort of negative externalities, right, that were not anticipated. And so I do think we're not very good at studying these kinds of things, right? There are some of those sort of touchstone studies where you implement some kind of intervention and you find that it creates this adverse effect that you completely did not expect, right? I think one potential pathway here, if I can get up on my soapbox and I tell my graduate students to try this a little bit more, there's a lot of sort of low-hanging fruit out there, unexplored fruit with regards to downstream experiments, right? So there's so many experimental interventions that are going on, right? And then the data collection stops by the people who are implementing the study, and then it's done, right? It's possible to go back the 5 years later, which Tom brought up, right? And not enough people are doing that. The intervention has still, like, the randomization still occurred, right? So you can get at the causal effects, but you can also get at sort of how other potential actors are responding to those causal effects, in addition to these questions of, like, did the treatment, like, take, or did it decay over a short period of time?
So I shouldn't step in here because I'm just thinking about it here, and I'm not good at thinking when I have lights in my eyes. Let's imagine two different universes, one in which all existing democracies, take Belgium, are the result of an historical aggregation in which small treatments that occurred naturally, if you will, scaled up, and that's why Belgium's a democracy, and that what we're actually seeing in Rwanda is some replication of that. And if that's true, then we should be able to go back and look at Belgian history and find evidence for those small-scale treatments and be able to trace the process by which they aggregated. Another possibility is that that's not how places like Belgium aggregated, that everything really took place at the macro level. That's what a century and a half of theorizing, going back to the great sociologists of the 19th century, have told us, that things like democracy and capitalism and the rise of bureaucratic, legal, rational states went together, and there's a reason they went together. If the latter is true, and I tend to think it is, but I can't identify anything causally, so what the hell do I know? If that's true, then the aggregation problem becomes twofold. One, develop a theory that would suggest that there's a whole new way to achieve democracy that we haven't seen before. And then two, figure out a way to test it. So I don't think we have an aggregation challenge until we have a theory that says this is how democracy is formed. Now, I should be a little bit more open to it, because we could tell a story of democracy in Europe by way of, say, social movements. And there's some literature on that, and that does actually suggest that there are, treatments of the sort you're speaking about that were major tributaries of democracy. I guess I sort of want some of the experimentalists to read some of the qualitative historical analyses, because we actually learn something by knowing about stuff.
I would kind of add to that point about this question about sort of why is it so difficult to theorize, right? That and why do we have so many inconsistent results? To take David's point, right? Charles Tilley's book on the development of the modern state in Europe. The subtitle of that book goes, I think, A.D. 900 to A.D. 1990. Right, right. So he's trying to talk about 1,000 years of history, right? Mozambique is 50 years old. Actually, Mozambique isn't 50 years old. Mozambique is 40-something years old, right? And so if we were to have sort of talked about sort of the development of a legal rationalist state in France in 1200, right? We would have been very disappointed, right? In France, and we've been trying to figure out, how did France fail? Right, and so I guess the part of my kind of, so why is it so difficult to theorize, right, is that we have a series of countries that experience something have a state experience that's fundamentally different from that of the only places where we know that we can all probably agree, right? There's a particular kind of liberal democracy, right? They were, for the most part, they were colonized, or they experienced a long period of Soviet domination. So there's highly sort of a very invasive external presence from the very, very moment of their or very early on in their existence. And then since their putative independence, there's continued to be interference, sometimes with goodwill, sometimes not, in their politics. And so it's hard to theorize, because the only places where we have stable democracy there's just it gets harder and harder and harder to say, oh, we can make that comparison that David's pointing out. I think David's right. It'd be nice to make that comparison, right? And so I just think that's one of the reasons why it's so hard to theorize, right? We're trying to compare Latin America, which had either the Spanish or the Portuguese, and an experience that ended something in the realm of 200 years ago, with Mozambique, whose colonial experience ends about 40 or 50 years ago, right? And we're trying to sort of make sense of how these comparisons work. And I think there's very, very hard comparisons to make. This is kind of a couple other questions here. We actually do have an Indian on our team. So Irfan Nuruddin was born in Bombay. And so I think the one thing I'll sort of point out to my friend with the Michigan sweatshirt is that I think you're right, that in a lot of cases, what we have seen is that non-democratic institutions, particularly violent ones, have been the means, in certain cases, been the means by which democracy has been implemented in certain places. All we have to do is think about the history of this country to say that the only way in which there is even a modicum of racial justice in the American South has been at the point of a gun. Right, and so the question of how non-democratic institutions can foment democratic change, I think, is something that the literature does not consider as a question in and of itself in precisely the way you asked, in precisely the way you asked it. But it's an interesting question. So, thank you.
Great. I'll collect a couple more.
Yeah, a couple more.
Yep.
Thank you again for the presentation. I was actually thinking, it kind of circulated. Isa brought it up in the beginning, and then a couple of other questions about interactions of treatments, and I can give an example. So in 2003, the CIA documents with regards to the Iranian revolution, so the Iranian CIA coup in 1953 comes out when they take out Mossadegh, because the British went and talked to the CIA. And there is a CIA operative who says, it is surprisingly cheap to run a successful coup. And my question is, with the presence of invisible interactions of treatments that we field test, and deep state operations, and field experiments by their very nature, because of IRB, tend to be done in very safe settings. Vanchukon goes to places where he knew he would not mess up electoral outcomes. Field experiments in Afghanistan that check out coin effectiveness tend to be in very safe settings. So, but the real stakes are in areas where invisible treatments are very likely to be present. So do policymakers worry about that, or should I not be worried about that? That we tend to test our ideas of, democracy promotion in places that are safe, but there isn't more devious machinations running around. So.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to follow up on the gentleman's question. And the understanding I have is USAID is working on long-term things and long-term plans and all that. What do you do when you have crises that just kind of spontaneously occur, like what you see in Hong Kong? I'm not sure the government recognized that something was going to happen, but there's an opportunity there for democracy promotion and achievement of gains. If you could comment on what do you do when you have I guess I say unplanned activities, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
I think we just had one more.
Thank you for the great panel. I wonder about, we have been talking about democracy promotion, but do you think democracy promotion means the same thing as in the 1990s and 2020s? So the last 30 years, the experiences that we had in the last 30 years seem to shape the meanings, the motivations, and the goals. And I wonder, your views about whether there is now a trend, opposite trend of autocracy promotion, and what does this democracy promoters can do to stand up against this, maybe the autocracy promotion? So, and how this change what we mean by democracy promotion itself? Thank you.
I can speak to the latter question. For the earlier questions, I don't do experiments, so I don't know, and I have no idea how they handle unplanned events. My guess is it'd be very difficult to mobilize resources quickly. So I think that we don't have very good research on autocracy promotion, but the gut instinct is that, yes, it's happening, and that, Russia and China are trying to sell their model of autocratic rule, and that we have this ideological battle going on, which is better. And I think it's kind of on us to, as Tom was mentioning earlier, can we illustrate that democracy can deliver? Like, does democracy deliver, or is it not? Are we in this crisis where democratic governments aren't able to give you the goods? But because a lot of this is, I would say, very recent, academics have not caught up. So, I'm doing some work right now on digital autocracy. So, what is digital autocracy? What are the consequences? And we have a need to know these things right now, but it takes forever to collect the data and then test it and all sorts of things. So in many ways, we're kind of lagging behind as this big wave of, the Russia-China push is happening.
Yeah, and this isn't just governments that are promoting autocracy, right? There are these networks of parties, individuals. Famous former advisor of our president is involved in some of these networks, right? And also corporations, right? And I'm not talking like sort of the conspiracy way, but developing technologies that help with surveillance and then selling that technology, exporting it. This is a big issue facing African countries, for example, facing journalists, civil society activists in those countries. It's becoming so much easier to surveil what potential dissidents or journalists are doing, and this is driven by a desire for profit, right?
My article is coming out tomorrow in Foreign Affairs on all of these things, so I'm going to make a subtle plug with two colleagues that this exportation of surveillance is very problematic and is contributing to longer-lasting dictatorships that are better able to withstand protests and all sorts of things.
Most of the time, people think about autocracy promotion as the availability of an outside option, right? So the argument being that for the longest time, there's only one game in town. So if you wanted to have your election certified, it had to be certified by the Carter Center, right? Or by sort of the OSCE, or sort of by a very reputable organization that was going to hold the autocrats' feet to the fire. And then so when the availability of other election observers who will not hold your feet to the fire as much. That's how I think of how the literature has tended to think of autocracy promotion in the way you're asking the question. It's one about sort of having this outside option that allows you to essentially just opt out of that democracy promotion game and be able to hold elections. Susan High had an article called "Catch Me If You Can," right? To kind of hold the election, still cheat, stay in powder, and be certified. Yeah. Right, and that's not necessarily an avowed way of doing autocracy promotion the way we think of democracy promotion, but it's about sort of putting that outside option out there to make it easier for people to kind of cheat and stay in power. And I think that's kind of a really interesting way of thinking about how that particular mechanism has worked, and it actually is a sort of little nexus, as Steph was pointing out, kind of a nexus of different organizations. Of sort of new NGOs that promote themselves as election monitors, for example, that does this, not just sort of China and Russia or others per se.
So I think a lot of these last questions is being related, and I really am glad you brought up, for example, the case of Iran in '53 and the overthrow of Mossadegh. There isn't enough study of autocracy promotion, but it was America doing it for a long time. I mean, I don't know how we could have this panel and just sort of, deny that, so thank you for asking the question. B, that means that there are some countries that are not open to current efforts at American democracy promotion, and there's a history of this. It's sort of the claim I was trying to make earlier in my paper, which is that there's a long history of interventions, and we tend to forget about them. I mean, efforts to change regimes, to exercise power on the global scale by changing regimes of potential allies, et cetera. There's a long history of this, I suppose, going back at least to the Napoleonic era, but not earlier. And so, and Dan was making the point also, it means in some instances, American democracy promotion is seen as illegitimate, so that one might say, for America to intervene in Hong Kong would have been an awful idea, just an awful idea, because at some level, who the hell are we? At another level, why should we believe we have any idea what to do? And at the third level, this would be a great excuse for a government to crack down more repressively because they think there's foreign intervention. So going back to the question of why is it so hard to have a theory, it's easy to have a theory, it's hard to have the correct theory. But one of the reasons might be because there's a tremendous amount of heterogeneity across time and space, and we don't know how to theorize all of that. And one of the problems is as soon as you start placing lots of scope conditions on your theory, it also makes it harder and harder to falsify that theory. So at the end of the day, we have a theory for every case, and that's a theory that's utterly worthless. So maybe it's just I'm actually very interested in your point about, say, studies of inequality. I'm almost surprised by that. But I feel like the world's a complicated place, and there's a way to say that that doesn't sound just so dumb, but I can't think of it right now, and so.
Well, so I don't know if democracy promotion is dead, but I do know that we're out of time. But before we totally conclude, I just wanted to say as kind of a last word, I think we really owe just an enormous debt of gratitude and of thanks to the authors who are here, the scholars who are here, as well as their co-authors who couldn't be here. They've put in, as you've seen, just an astonishing amount of work into this over the last 5-6 years to try to assemble what we know about democratization and to try to make that knowledge usable in the policy community. And that's not an easy task. I'm sure it felt thankless at many times. But hopefully in bringing you here, I'm really glad you could all come. I think we're privileged you'd all come to Michigan to talk about the work that you did. But just please join me in thanking our scholars for the work they've done. Thanks.